A strange silence. Ryan woke up to a strange silence, the kind of silence that didn't feel right. For days, he had been staying on this alien planet with a family that had been nothing but welcoming to him. Their home was unlike anything he had ever seen. Walls that glowed faintly, furniture that moved on its own, and a constant hum that filled the air. But tonight, the hum was gone, and the silence pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. He sat up in his bed, rubbing his eyes. Something felt off. His room was dark, except for the faint glow of the walls. But it wasn't the darkness that bothered him. It was the door. The door to his room, which he had closed tightly before going to sleep, was now slightly open. Just a crack, but enough for him to see the hallway beyond. Ryan frowned. He was sure he had closed it. Living on an alien planet was already nerve-wracking, and he had made it a habit to lock his door every night. He didn't fully trust this place, even though his alien host, Taran, and his family had been kind. Yet here he was, staring at an open door. The silence was broken by a soft creak. It came from somewhere outside his room. Ryan froze, his heart thudding in his chest. Was it just the house settling? Or was someone, or something, out there? He swung his legs off the bed and stood up, his bare feet touching the cool, smooth floor. Slowly, he walked toward the door, his body tense with unease. He stopped a few steps away, peering through the crack. The hallway was dimly lit, the glowing walls casting a soft, bluish light. Then he saw it. A shadow moved across the hallway, quick and silent. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't Taran. He was taller and heavier. This shadow was slender and graceful. His mind immediately went to Asira, Taran's younger sister. Asira had always been different, while Taran and the rest of his family were polite and reserved. Asira was unpredictable. Her sharp eyes always seemed to watch Ryan with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She rarely spoke to him, but when she did, her words were cryptic, as if she knew something he didn't. Ryan hesitated. Should he open the door and step into the hallway, or should he close it and pretend he hadn't seen anything? The smart choice was obvious. Close the door, lock it, and go back to bed. But curiosity gnawed at him. What was Asira doing wandering the house at this hour? He took a step closer to the door, and then another. Carefully, he pushed it open just enough to stick his head out. The hallway was empty. No sign of the shadow. Asira. He called out softly, his voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Ryan stepped into the hallway, his eyes scanning the area. The glowing walls made the house feel alive, like it was watching him as much as he was watching it. He walked slowly, his bare feet making no sound on the smooth floor. As he passed by Asira's room, he noticed her door was slightly open too. He paused, glancing inside. The room was dark, but he could make out the faint shape of the bed. It was empty. His pulse quickened. Where was she? Another sound broke the silence. This time it was behind him. A soft, almost inaudible shuffle. Ryan spun around, his heart pounding. The hallway was still empty, but he felt it now, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Asira, he said again, louder this time. Is that you? Still no answer. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. He turned his head sharply, but whatever it was had already disappeared around the corner. Ryan's breathing was shallow now, his skin prickling with unease. This wasn't normal. Something was very wrong. He thought about going back to his room, closing the door, and locking it. But a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that if he did, he'd be ignoring something important. He moved toward the corner where he had seen the movement, his steps cautious. As he rounded the corner, he froze. Asira was standing there, her back to him. Her long, silvery hair flowed down her back, shimmering faintly in the dim light. Her shoulders were tense, and her hands hung by her sides, fingers twitching slightly. Asira, he said, his voice trembling slightly. She turned her head slowly to look at him. Her glowing violet eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, Ryan felt like he couldn't breathe. There was something different about her, something he couldn't put into words. "You shouldn't be out here," she said, her voice low and strange, almost like a growl. Ryan swallowed hard. I heard something. I thought it was you." Her lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't comforting. "Go back to your room, Ryan. And whatever you do, don't leave the door open." With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Ryan stood there for a moment, his heart racing. He didn't understand what was happening, but one thing was clear. He had made a mistake by stepping out of his room. As he walked back to his room, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah wasn't herself. And when he closed the door behind him, he couldn't bring himself to lock it. Instead, he left it slightly open, a crack of light spilling into the darkness. But as he lay back in bed, staring at the open door, he couldn't help but feel that leaving it open was a mistake he would soon regret. The sister's secret. Ryan jolted awake to the sound of faint humming. It wasn't the familiar hum of the glowing alien walls. It was a melody, low, haunting, and unlike anything he'd heard before. It felt like it was pulling him, calling him. For a moment, he thought it was a dream, but the sound was too real, vibrating faintly through the floor. His eyes darted to the door. He had left it slightly open, against his better judgment. A sliver of light from the hallway spilled into the room, stretching across the floor like a glowing thread, leading him toward it. The melody grew louder, as if beckoning him. Ryan hesitated, his heart pounding. Was this another one of Sarah's strange games? She had warned him not to leave his room. But then again, why would she be singing in the middle of the night? And why did it sound so sorrowful? Against his better instincts, Ryan swung his legs off the bed and approached the door. The closer he got, the clearer the melody became. It was beautiful, but unsettling. It carried an emotion he couldn't place. Longing, sadness, and something darker, something he couldn't name. He stepped into the hallway, the cool floor sending a chill up his spine. The walls glowed faintly, casting soft shadows that seemed to shift as he moved. The melody was coming from further down the corridor, near the family's communal living space. As Ryan crept closer, he spotted Sarah. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her back to him, illuminated by the faint blue light of the walls. Her silvery hair shimmered as she swayed slightly to the rhythm of her own voice. "Sarah," he called softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She stopped singing instantly, her head tilting slightly to the side, as if she'd heard him, but wasn't sure whether to respond. Ryan took a cautious step closer. "Are you okay?" Slowly, Sarah turned to face him. Her glowing violet eyes were brighter than he remembered, almost piercing. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of calm and something else, something primal. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange melodic undertone. Ryan stopped in his tracks. "You were singing. I thought." "You thought wrong," she interrupted, rising to her feet in one smooth motion. She was taller than him, her slender frame almost too graceful as she stood. "I told you not to leave your room." Ryan frowned. "You also didn't explain why. What's going on with you, Sarah? You're different." Sarah's gaze softened for a moment, but then she turned away, her shoulders tense. "You wouldn't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. "Try me," Ryan said, stepping closer despite the growing unease in his chest. Sarah laughed softly, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was bitter, almost sad. "It's not something I can control, Ryan. This phase, it's part of what I am." She turned to face him again, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "And it's dangerous for you." "Dangerous?" Ryan repeated, his voice rising slightly. "What do you mean? If there's something wrong, let me help." "You can't help me," she said sharply, her voice echoing slightly in the corridor. "This is my burden. My family knows what to do. They'd always do. But you don't belong here, Ryan. You don't understand the risks." Her words stung, but they also made him more curious. "Then explain it to me," he insisted, "because right now it feels like you're hiding something, and I don't like being left in the dark." Sarah's expression shifted. For a brief moment, Ryan thought he saw a flicker of pain, of vulnerability. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by the unreadable mask she always wore. "It's not just me who's at risk," she said finally, her voice low. "It's you too. If I lose control—" She trailed off, taking a deep breath as if steadying herself. "Just stay in your room. Lock the door, and don't leave it open again." Before Ryan could respond, Sarah turned and walked away, her footsteps almost silent against the smooth floor. He stood there, watching her disappear into the shadows, his mind racing with questions. What did she mean by losing control? And why did she seem so afraid? As Ryan turned to head back to his room, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Along the walls near where Sarah had been sitting were faint scratches, as if claws had raked across the surface. He knelt down to get a closer look, running his fingers over the marks. They were deep and fresh. A chill ran down his spine. He stood up quickly, his mind now more unsettled than ever. Whatever Sarah was going through, it wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. And for some reason, it felt like it was only the beginning. When Ryan finally returned to his room, he locked the door this time. But even as he lay back down, staring at the glowing ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's warning wasn't just for him. It was for herself, too. The warning. Ryan couldn't shake the memory of Sarah's glowing violet eyes from the night before. Her cryptic words echoed in his mind. "If I lose control, it's dangerous for you." The scratches on the walls had only added to his unease, and the house no longer felt as safe as it had a few days ago. The morning light spilling into the hallway did little to ease his nerves as he made his way to the kitchen. The house, normally humming with quiet energy, was unusually still. Taryn, Sarah's older brother and the head of the family, was seated at the long, curved dining table. His sharp, angular features looked even more severe under the dim blue light of the walls. "You're up early," Taryn said without looking at Ryan. His voice was calm, but carried a weight that immediately put Ryan on edge. "I couldn't sleep," Ryan admitted, sliding into the seat across from him. "I need to ask you something about Sarah." At the mention of her name, Taryn's expression darkened. His glowing blue eyes locked onto Ryan with an intensity that made him want to shrink into his seat. "What about her?" Taryn asked, his voice quieter now, but no less commanding. Ryan hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "She was acting strange last night. She told me not to leave my room. And then I found these." He stopped, realizing he was about to mention the scratches. "Scratches?" Taryn finished for him, his tone grim. Ryan nodded slowly. "On the walls. Deep ones. She wouldn't explain anything, just said it's not safe." Taryn leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, his gaze fixed on Ryan, as if deciding whether or not to speak. Finally, he sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. "You shouldn't have left your room," he said. "That's what she said, too," Ryan replied, his frustration bubbling up. "But no one's telling me why. If I'm in danger, don't I deserve to know what's going on?" Taryn's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Sarah is entering her Soren phase. It's a biological cycle that happens to our kind once every few decades. During this time, she's not herself." "What does that mean?" Ryan pressed, his voice rising slightly. "It means she's dangerous," Taryn snapped, his usually composed demeanor cracking. "Her instincts take over. She can't control them, no matter how hard she tries. That's why she told you to stay in your room." Ryan's stomach twisted. "So what happens if she loses control?" Taryn's gaze hardened. "You don't want to find out." The weight of his words settled over Ryan like a heavy fog. He opened his mouth to ask more questions, but Taryn cut him off. "Listen to me carefully, Ryan," Haran said, his tone firm. "For the next 3 nights, do not leave your room. Lock your door. Seal the edges if you can. And whatever you do, do not let her in." Ryan stared at him, trying to process what he was hearing. "You're talking like she's some kind of monster," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's not a monster," Taryn replied sharply. "She's my sister, but during the Solrin phase, she's not in control of herself. It's a natural process, but it's dangerous for anyone who isn't prepared for it." "Why didn't you warn me earlier?" Ryan asked, anger creeping into his voice. "Because I didn't think it would matter," Taryn said bluntly. "You're not her target. Or at least, you weren't supposed to be." Ryan's blood ran cold at those words. "What do you mean, target?" Taryn stood abruptly, towering over Ryan. "I said enough. Just do as I say, and you'll be safe. Don't test her, Ryan. And don't test me." Before Ryan could respond, Taryn turned and left the room, leaving him alone with his racing thoughts. That night, Ryan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the door. He had locked it and pushed a heavy chair against it for good measure, but Taryn's warning still rang in his ears. As the hours ticked by, the house grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that pressed against his ears and made his skin crawl. He tried to convince himself that he was overreacting, that Sarah's strange behavior was just a cultural quirk he didn't understand. But deep down, he knew better. And then he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a faint scratch, like nails dragging across the other side of the door. Ryan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate. And then came the voice, soft, trembling, and unmistakably Sarah's. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice laced with desperation. "Please, open the door. I need your help." His hands clenched into fists as he stared at the door, his heart pounding in his chest. "Ryan," she called again, louder this time. I can't hold on anymore. Please, let me in." He didn't move, didn't speak. Taryn's warning echoed in his mind. Don't let her in. But as the scratching turned into pounding, and her voice grew more desperate, Ryan found himself questioning how much longer the door would hold. The heat begins. The silence in Ryan's room was suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic pounding of his heart. He hadn't slept. How could he, knowing what lurked just beyond the door? The night dragged on, stretching every second into an eternity. He stared at the faint glow of the alien walls, trying to distract himself, but his ears stayed tuned to every sound outside. Every creak of the house made him flinch. And then it came. A soft, almost hesitant scratching against the door. His stomach twisted into a knot. He sat up, frozen, watching the door as if it might suddenly burst open. The scratching was slow and deliberate, like fingernails grazing the wood. Then a voice. "Ryan." His breath caught. It was Sarah. Her voice was soft, trembling, and yet there was something about it that sent chills down his spine. "Ryan, I know you're in there. Please." Her words dragged, her tone both pleading and dangerous. "I need you." Ryan's mind raced. Taryn's warning echoed in his head. Do not let her in. Do not trust her. But this didn't sound like a cryptic, guarded Sarah he knew. This voice was raw, vulnerable, desperate. He got up slowly, his bare feet touching the cold floor. He moved toward the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the chair he had wedged against it. "Ryan," Sarah called again, louder this time. The desperation in her voice had grown sharper. I can't control it. You have to help me." His hand froze on the chair. "Help her? How?" He pressed his ear to the door. "Sarah," he said, his voice low but firm. "What's happening to you?" There was silence for a moment, and then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to warn you. I told you to stay away." Her tone cracked, and he heard a faint sob. "But it's too late now. Please, Ryan, I don't want to hurt you." His pulse quickened. "Then go back to your room," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I can't," she replied. It's not that simple." The scratching stopped, replaced by a loud thud as something heavy slammed against the door. Ryan stumbled back, his heart racing. "Asira," he shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Her breathing was audible now, ragged and uneven. "It's getting stronger," she said, almost to herself. I need to get away before." "Before what?" Ryan didn't want to find out. He grabbed the chair and pushed it tighter against the door, his hands shaking. "Asira, listen to me," he said, trying to sound calm. "You don't want to hurt me, right? So just leave. Go to Taran. He'll know what to do." She let out a bitter laugh, one that sent shivers down his spine. "Taran. He's already decided what to do. Lock me away, like always." Her voice grew louder, angrier. "But not this time. I'm done being treated like a prisoner." Another thud rattled the door. This time, it cracked slightly under the force. Ryan's heart dropped. "Asira, stop," he shouted. "I'm sorry, Ryan," she said, her voice trembling again. "I don't want to do this, but it's not my choice anymore." The door creaked under another hit, and Ryan stumbled back, his mind racing. He had to think of something. He couldn't just let her in, but he also couldn't keep her out forever. "Asira, wait," he shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "Just tell me what's happening. Maybe I can help." There was a long pause, and for a moment, he thought she might actually stop. But when she spoke, her voice was hollow, defeated. "You can't help me," she said. "No one can." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. And then the pounding stopped. Ryan stayed frozen, his breath caught in his throat. The silence was deafening, and every second stretched on endlessly. Was she gone? Or was she waiting for him to open the door? He crept closer, his ear pressed to the crack. He couldn't hear her breathing anymore. Slowly, he knelt and peered through the small gap beneath the door. Nothing. He exhaled shakily, standing up again. Maybe she had left. Maybe she had finally given up. But just as he was about to step away, the door buckled violently, the crack widening as splinters flew into the room. A glowing violet eye peered through the gap, locking onto his. "Ryan," Asira whispered, her voice low and guttural now. "You should have listened." The door gave way with a deafening crash, and Ryan stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. Asira stood in the doorway, her silhouette glowing faintly in the dim light. Her eyes burned with a wild intensity, and her silvery hair seemed to float as if caught in an invisible wind. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ryan's mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. Asira's gaze softened, just for a second, and her lips parted as if she was about to speak. But then, her glowing hand reached for him, and Ryan knew he had run out of time. A risky decision. Ryan's chest heaved as he ran through the dark, glowing hallways of the alien house. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint blue light, casting eerie shadows as he moved. His mind raced, replaying the moment Asira had shattered through the door. The wild, glowing look in her violet eyes wasn't something he could forget. She wasn't the Asira he knew anymore. This was something else entirely. The sound of her footsteps echoed faintly behind him. Slow, measured. She wasn't chasing him. Not exactly. It was worse than that. She was hunting him. "Asira, please," he called out, his voice trembling. "You don't have to do this." Her laughter floated through the hall, soft and melodic, but chilling. "Do what, Ryan?" she asked, her voice carrying an almost playful edge. "You're the one running. I haven't even touched you. Yet." Ryan's legs carried him into the family's main gathering room, a large, open space with furniture that glided silently along the floors. He stopped, his breath catching as he realized he'd made a mistake. There were no doors here, no safe corners to hide. The faint glow of the walls flickered, and Ryan turned toward the doorway he had just come through. As Sarah stepped into the room, her silhouette framed by the dim light, her silver hair floated around her like a living thing, and her eyes glowed brighter than ever. "You can't keep running," she said softly, taking a step closer. Ryan backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, though he wasn't sure what good it would do. Sarah tilted her head, her lips curling into a small, amused smile. "Hurt me? Oh, Ryan, you couldn't hurt me even if you tried." She stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. Ryan's mind scrambled for a way out, a way to stop this. And then, like a flash of lightning, he remembered something Taryn had said during one of their earlier conversations about his people. During their Solrin phase, their senses are heightened. Sounds, smells, even emotions. Everything becomes amplified. That's why isolation is so important. If Azara's senses were in overdrive, then maybe, just maybe, he could use that against her. It was a long shot, and he had no idea if it would work, but it was better than standing there waiting for her to pounce. Ryan looked around the room, his eyes landing on a cluster of floating orbs near the ceiling. He had seen these before, small devices that emitted frequencies to keep the house in harmony. Taryn had once told him that the orbs could be overloaded if tampered with. Sarah took another step closer, her glowing eyes fixed on him. "What are you thinking, Ryan?" she asked, her voice soft and dangerous. "You look so tense." Ryan forced himself to stay calm, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I'm thinking you don't want to do this," he said, his voice steadying slightly. Her smile faltered, just for a moment, and Ryan took the opportunity to edge closer to the wall where the orbs were anchored. "I don't want to hurt you," she said, her tone quieter now. "But it's not my choice anymore. This phase, it controls me." Ryan's heart ached at the vulnerability in her words, but he couldn't let it distract him. He reached up toward the nearest orb, his fingers brushing against its smooth surface. He twisted it slightly, just as Taryn had shown him, and the orb began to pulse with a faint, irregular glow. Sarah's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her hand raising to shield her face. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharper now. Ryan didn't answer. He twisted the second orb, then the third. The room began to vibrate with a low hum, the frequency rising steadily. The walls pulsed in time with the sound, and Sarah stumbled, her movements unsteady. "Stop it," she shouted, her voice breaking. "Ryan, stop." But he didn't stop. He activated the final orb, and the hum turned into a piercing tone that filled the room. Sarah dropped to her knees, clutching her head as the glow in her eyes flickered. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Ryan said, his voice trembling. "But I can't let you hurt me, or yourself." Sarah's breathing was ragged, and for a moment, Ryan thought she might lash out again. But then, she collapsed to the floor, the light in her eyes dimming as her body went still. The sound of the orbs faded, leaving the room in silence once more. Ryan stood there, his chest heaving, as he stared at Sarah's motionless form. He didn't know if she was unconscious or if the phase had ended, but he wasn't about to stick around to find out. Turning toward the door, he ran. He needed to find Taryn. If anyone could help Sarah now, it was him. But as he left the room, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't seen the last of her, not by a long shot. The confrontation. Ryan skidded to a halt in the glowing hallway, his breath ragged, his heart hammering against his ribs. Behind him, the sound of faint footsteps echoed, steady and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. "Sarah," he whispered to himself, his mind racing for answers. "What happened to you?" Before he could think of his next move, Taryn appeared at the end of the hallway, his tall, imposing figure a welcome sight. His glowing blue eyes locked onto Ryan with a mix of anger and urgency. "Ryan." Taryn's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "What have you done?" Ryan stumbled forward, relief washing over him for a brief moment. "She's out of control, Taryn. She broke into my room. She's not herself." Taryn's expression darkened as he stepped closer, his presence radiating authority. "I warned you not to leave your room," he said sharply, his tone heavy with frustration. "Do you have any idea what you've unleashed?" Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows. Both men turned to see Asera emerging from the darkness, her silver hair flowing unnaturally, her glowing violet eyes locked onto them. "Taryn," she said, her voice laced with both venom and desperation. "Always the protector, always in control." Taryn stepped in front of Ryan, his stance protective. "Asera, this isn't you. You need to stop before it's too late." Asera laughed bitterly, her gaze darting between the two men. "Too late," she said, her voice rising. "You've spent your whole life keeping me caged, Taryn, telling me what I can and can't do. But this time I won't let you stop me." Ryan felt the tension crackling in the air like static electricity. He glanced at Taryn, whose jaw was set, his fists clenched. "She's completely lost to the phase," Taryn muttered under his breath. "Her instincts have taken over." "What does that mean?" Ryan asked, his voice shaking. Taryn's glowing eyes flicked to him, a mix of regret and determination in his expression. "It means she sees everyone as either a threat or a target." Before Ryan could fully process the implications, Asera lunged forward, her movements impossibly fast. Taryn reacted instantly, meeting her head-on with a force that sent a shockwave through the hallway. The impact threw Ryan to the ground, and he scrambled to his feet, watching in stunned silence as the two siblings clashed. Taryn's strength was formidable, but Asera's movements were wild, unpredictable. She fought with a ferocity that bordered on primal, her glowing eyes locked onto him even as she battled her brother. "Taryn, don't hurt her," Ryan shouted, panic lacing his voice. "I'm not trying to hurt her." Taryn growled as he deflected one of Asera's strikes. "I'm trying to save her. And you." Ryan's mind raced. He couldn't just stand there while they fought. There had to be a way to stop this without anyone getting hurt. He remembered the orbs in the living room, the frequency he had used to bring her down earlier. If he could recreate that effect here, it might be enough to subdue her again. He glanced around the hallway, his eyes landing on a small control panel embedded in the wall. Taryn had shown it to him once, a system that controlled the energy flow throughout the house. It was risky, but it was the only idea he had. "I'll buy you time," Taryn shouted, as if reading Ryan's mind. "Do what you have to." Ryan nodded and sprinted toward the panel, his fingers flying over the alien symbols. He didn't fully understand the technology, but he remembered Taryn's instructions well enough to navigate it. Behind him, the sounds of the siblings' fight grew louder, more desperate. Asera's growls mixed with Taryn's grunts of effort as they clashed. Ryan's heart pounded as he activated the system, adjusting the frequencies to match the ones he had used earlier. "Almost there," he muttered to himself, his hands shaking. Suddenly, Asera's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and pained. "Ryan, stop." He turned to see her struggling against Taryn's grip, her glowing eyes filled with something unexpected. Fear. For a moment, she looked like the Asera he remembered, the guarded but kind alien who had welcomed him into her home. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't do this." Ryan hesitated, his hand hovering over the final control. "Don't listen to her," Taryn shouted, his voice strained as he tried to hold her back. "She's trying to manipulate you." Ryan's mind raced. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Was this truly Asera, begging for mercy? Or was it the phase, twisting her into something unrecognizable? With a deep breath, he made his decision. He pressed the final control, and the hallway erupted with a low, pulsing hum. Asera cried out, her body convulsing as the frequency washed over her. Taran released her and stepped back, his face a mask of pain and regret. Ryan watched as the light in Asera's eyes flickered, her movements growing weaker until she collapsed to the floor. The hum faded, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Ryan stood frozen, his chest heaving, as Taran knelt beside Asera's motionless form. "She's alive," Taran said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But this isn't over." Ryan's relief was short-lived as he looked at Asera, her face pale, her body trembling slightly. Whatever this phase was, it wasn't finished with her yet. And Ryan knew the real challenge was only just beginning. A surprising resolution. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with a strange, unspoken tension. Ryan stood frozen, his chest heaving as his eyes darted between Asera's unconscious form and Taran, who knelt beside her. The glow in Asera's eyes had faded to a dim flicker, but her body still trembled slightly, as if caught between worlds, herself and whatever primal force this Soulrun phase had awakened. "She won't stay down for long," Taran said, his voice low but urgent. "You've bought us time, but it's not enough. If we don't do something, the phase will consume her completely." Ryan swallowed hard, his mind racing. "Then what do we do? I can't just watch her suffer like this." Taran looked at him, his glowing blue eyes filled with both guilt and determination. "There's one way to stop it, but it's not something I can do. Only you can." Ryan blinked in confusion. "What are you talking about? You're her brother. You've been through this before. Surely you know how to help her." Taran stood, his tall frame towering over Ryan. "This isn't about family," he said, his voice calm but laced with a hint of frustration. "The Soulrun phase isn't something I can resolve. It's biological, instinctual. It demands a bond, an emotional and physical anchor, to pull her out of it." Ryan's heart sank as the weight of Taran's words hit him. "You're saying she needs me?" "Yes," Taran said simply. "That's insane," Ryan shot back, his voice rising. "I don't even know what's happening half the time on this planet. How am I supposed to be her anchor?" Taran's expression softened slightly. "You don't understand what you've already done for her, Ryan. She doesn't talk about it, but she's different around you. Calmer, more herself. That connection, it's rare, even among our kind. You've already started something, whether you realize it or not." Ryan looked at Asera, her fragile form lying on the smooth floor. The thought of being her anchor felt overwhelming, impossible even. But as he stared at her, he couldn't deny the pang of guilt and responsibility building in his chest. How do I even do that?" he asked hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. Taran stepped closer, his tone softening. "It's not about force or control. It's about trust. You have to reach her, not this primal version of her, but the Asera you know. The part of her that's still in there, fighting to break free." Ryan knelt beside her, his hands trembling slightly. He reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently placing his hand on her shoulder. Her skin was warm, almost unnaturally so, and he could feel the faint vibrations of her energy beneath his fingertips. "Asera," he said softly, leaning closer. "It's me, Ryan. I know you're still in there. I'm not leaving you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Asera stirred slightly, a faint groan escaping her lips. Her glowing violet eyes fluttered open, unfocused and wild. But as they locked onto Ryan, something shifted. "Ryan," she murmured, her voice weak but recognizable. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos raging inside him. "You told me not to leave the door open. Well, I didn't just leave it open. I'm stepping through it. You're not alone in this, Asera." Her expression softened, and the tension in her body began to ease. The glow in her eyes dimmed further, replaced by something deeper, something unmistakably her. Taran watched silently, his expression unreadable as Ryan continued to speak to Asera, his voice a steady, calming presence. "It's okay," Ryan said. "You don't have to fight this alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Sarah's breathing steadied, and she slowly sat up, her movements cautious and deliberate. Her violet eyes met Ryan's, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they were clear. You saved me," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Ryan smiled faintly, relief washing over him. "I didn't do it alone. You fought just as hard." Taran stepped forward, his towering presence no longer intimidating, but instead filled with quiet respect. "You've done more than I ever could, Ryan. Thank you." Ryan looked up at him, shaking his head. "I didn't know what I was doing. I just couldn't let her go." Taran nodded, his expression softening. "Sometimes that's all it takes." Sarah turned to Ryan, her gaze filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "You stayed," she said softly, "even when I told you not to. Why?" Ryan hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because you're worth saving," he said finally. For the first time since he'd arrived on this alien planet, Ryan felt something he hadn't expected: belonging. Sarah reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and steady. As the tension in the room faded, Ryan realized that this was just the beginning. There was still so much he didn't understand about Sarah, about her people, about this strange connection they shared. But for now, as the faint hum of the house returned and Sarah's glowing eyes softened into a calm light, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't leaving. And as Sarah smiled, a real, genuine smile, Ryan knew he'd made the right choice.